Hello and welcome to the Civil Rights Enforcement Agency podcast, Civil Rights and You, the show that focuses on federal, state, and local civil rights and human rights issues and how they impact your daily life. My name is Charles Bryson, Director, Civil Rights Enforcement Agency, under the auspices of Mayor Lyda Crewson and your host. Playing as always is Ronnie Jordan's theme, The Antidote, which we do not have the rights to. This podcast can be seen Facebook Live and recorded at mymusicmycity.com. Today we have a number of people around the table to talk about Alzheimer's and the work of the Alzheimer's Association Greater Missouri chapter and how it can help and how you can help in their efforts and how they can help in your efforts. With me today are Adrian Holden.
Hello,
right?
yes.
Dr. Bo Ansis.
Thank you for having me here.
Ray Long.
Thank you for having me.
I'm doing good so far. And Lonnie Schicker.
Schicker, right.
Thank you. Close. Okay, so welcome. So let's start off. Doctor, what's Alzheimer's?
Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disease. So that's a process that slowly occurs that affects the brain. So what happens is that we have these brain cells or neurons that allow us to talk and allow us to kind of remember and allow us to have those kind of special memories of individuals. What happens in Alzheimer's disease is that there are changes in those brain cells so that they don't function as well, and because of that, individuals lose their memory and then lose their personality and who they really are.
And so do people know at the time, or do friends and family members know at the time that, well, maybe Charles is losing it a little bit and maybe we need to have him checked out?
Yes, so it's a very difficult disease, and what I would tell you is that it is a slowly progressive disease. So when an individual comes in to see me in the clinic, it is not just that one day they didn't have Alzheimer's disease and the next day they did. It's a slowly changing process. And so individuals, they may or may not have that insight, but it's often family members that we're actually having them also come in who serve as, quote, a collateral source that give us that information. So let me give you an example. So what I ask individuals are you doing the taxes? And if they say, I don't do the taxes, the next question I ask them is, did you ever do the taxes? And if they never did the taxes, that's one thing. But if they used to do the taxes and were an accountant and now can't do it, that's a change in their baseline, which is very important. You can do those same kinds of things with, are you a Cardinals fan? Are you any kind of other things that you like? That gives me a change in the person, which is extremely important in the diagnosis of that individual.
So how do you differentiate Alzheimer's versus someone who may or may not have known they've had a series of mild strokes and therefore that has caused a change or an effect?
So it's a very difficult process. So kind of a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, we kind of try to rule out other etiologies, meaning other things that could be causing some of these thinking problems before we go down that pathway. So first of all, if we have strokes or other kinds of things, we ask them, often it's all of a sudden they had weakness on one side of their body. Other kinds of changes did they experience with this? We also look for other kinds of infections. So if they have certain kinds of infections, these we call reversible causes of dementia. They may also have vitamin deficiency, so B12 deficiency, or thyroid issues. So we kind of try to rule out those issues or those etiologies. Often we're left with trying to get a picture of the brain, if the individual can tolerate that, and then we often do other kinds of testing. So there are now tests that we can do to help make that kind of diagnosis, which we didn't have even 10 years ago.
Now, you added a term, which was actually further down my notes, but that's okay. You added the term dementia.
Right.
So how did you make that leap from us having a conversation about Alzheimer's, which is memory loss and other skill loss, to dementia?
Right. So dementia, if I were going to give you an analogy, it would be dementia is an umbrella. So an umbrella term. That means people who are not able to do the activities of daily living that make them who they are. So they may have deficits in a lot of different, we call it domains or ways to kind of perform those activities. If you were to go down the street or go down a little bit farther from here and go to a casino and you were going to say, what is the most likely cause of dementia?
I'm not going to ask you how you knew the casino wasn't that far away. We'll save that for a later one. But you just told her, you know.
But needless to say, if you were to go to make a bet, 2/3 of the time you'd be right if you went Alzheimer's disease. However, there are other kinds of dementias or other kinds of changes in thinking, and Lonnie can talk to you about some of those, is that there are other kinds. So there's something called frontotemporal dementia. There's dementia with Lewy bodies. There's vascular dementia. So there's this whole huge umbrella, and then each of those spokes that are a part of it are different kinds of dementia, but the most common one is Alzheimer's disease.
So in effect, you may have dementia, which may have been because of Alzheimer's, or you may have dementia due to something else.
Yes, and I'll even throw one more into you, is that nobody really reads the textbooks. So when they come in and see me, they may have some cognitive issues or thinking problems due to Alzheimer's disease, but also a combination of other things, like vascular changes that are also occurring that are leading to some thinking problems. So in reality, it can be that they may have Alzheimer's disease, but they may also have other blend of other things that are also going on that are leading to some of those cognitive changes.
Is there a way to reverse Alzheimer's?
I wish. I really do. I would love to be, in fact, I would love to not be here and talking about Alzheimer's disease, because if we had that cure, I would be on a nice island with a little girly drink and with the umbrella on it. But I'm not. And I'm seeing a lot of patients that do have Alzheimer's disease. Right now, we don't have that cure. We do not have medications.
But it's part of you not having the cure because we don't necessarily know what I'll use the word all, but know what the causes are.
We have a much better understanding, and I would tell you, I hope I still look young on the TV over there, but I would tell you that even when I was in medical school, we used to think about people having thinking problems, and we would say that's just natural. That's, quote, senile dementia is the kind of term that we would just say, is that you get old naturally and you're going to forget in doing that. That is a case where you will have a little bit of forgetfulness, but really what's happening in these diseases like Alzheimer's disease is that it's more than just that, just little forgetfulness. It's a lot more other areas that are being affected in these individuals. So we now have that ability, though, which we didn't have 10 years ago, to make these kinds of diagnoses. And in fact, in individuals before they're even developing those cognitive impairment. Because right now what happens to me is a lot of those individuals, as you were just saying, is that a family member notices grandma, mom, dad, some loved one is not able to do those things and they're bringing them in. By the time they're having those significant cognitive issues, there's been a whole host of changes, and including some of these changes called amyloid and tau, that have occurred 10 to 15 years before that individual who's now presenting to me with those cognitive changes.
So I'm going to get Ray on in a second, but the prompt question is, I don't believe I don't believe, or I don't want to believe, my family member is beginning to go downhill. And that what meant, because my note is there bluntness by medical professionals in telling someone they have Alzheimer's? The backup question to that is, I don't want to see my parents get older. I don't want to. So I do things to sort of keep them on track. No, because I don't want to know that answer is, well, they're sliding downhill and they may have Alzheimer's.
Yeah, it's a very difficult pathway. And so what we do is we like, and all of us like to do, is the cover for other individuals. And when you're starting to notice that you're covering a lot more for a lot of those things that they used to be able to do, that kind of sparks something in you. And
or it should.
It should, but not everybody does that, because we have very tight-knit families, and we have a number of individuals who kind of rally the charge and do that. And what I'm hoping is that more people will come out, more people will start to talk about this, because there is a kind of shame that is associated with the term Alzheimer's disease, and really we need to
And dementia.
and dementia, because everybody says that's dementia. I'm very worried about that. But there are a lot of now options available. We can give you more information. We can work with the Alzheimer's Association, work with family members to kind of give you a support system that would be helpful to you, the caregiver, as well as to the individual. Because remember, when I'm seeing that individual in the office, I'm not just treating the individual who may have dementia or Alzheimer's disease. I'm also treating the family members, and I have to tell them, hey, you need to take breaks. You need to do these kinds of things as well. Here are resources available in the Alzheimer's Association in St. Louis, which is fantastic, and a great organization. Here are some other resources available to you so that you're not alone. But a lot of people are not doing that, and we really need to have people come in and say, hey, I need you to evaluate mom, dad, friend, whoever it is, and come into the clinic and get that evaluation.
Ray, let's get you in. My notation says that you lost a family member, which I'm certainly sorry for. Did you notice things along the way that began to happen and your mother's life began to change, that you would say, hey, this is different than a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago? How did you notice those changes?
Well, my mother had Alzheimer's for about 20 years, and we didn't live in the same location. I lived here, and she lived in Ohio. I'm originally from Ohio. And actually, she noticed something was going on with herself before I did. She would come to visit us, and there'd be little things that we would notice, but we wouldn't attribute them to anything in particular other than she was just getting older, and our memories aren't as sharp as they once were. And so initially, I wouldn't say that I paid a whole lot of attention to it, but as time went along, it got more dramatic. And probably about 5 years into her condition was when I realized that something is significantly going on differently than the past. But one indication that I probably should have picked up on was when I go to visit her in Ohio, my mother had a gym bag full of over-the-counter memory-related drugs. So she knew she was changing. And then she told me some time after that she admitted she knew something was changing about her.
So she was self-medicating.
Yes.
As a way of lessening the condition.
Well, not so much lessening condition as masking the condition, because she was just trying to not make it known to other family members that she had an issue.
So she came out to you and said, I'm doing this.
Well, she said that how she phrased it was like, there comes a time in your life there's a change, and she's going through a change. And that's how she expressed what she thought was happening. She didn't say, I'm losing it and I can't remember anything. She just said, I'm going through a change now.
So after 5 years in, you all went to, I'll say you all, went to the doctor.
It'd been nice if it had been that easy, but it wasn't.
Was it because of her or because of you?
Because of her.
She didn't want to go?
No. It took me a long time to get her to a doctor, to get her diagnosed, because she didn't want to have it, somebody qualify what she already knew. And so that would have made it official, and she didn't want to do that.
So she didn't want to go because that label would then be placed on her. How did you finally get her to go? You didn't just throw her in the car and we're going.
No, there were a lot of failed attempts, and finally I got her GP or general practitioner to recommend, with both of us in the room, that she need to see someone who specialized in neurological conditions. And it was difficult then because I remember the day we were going for the appointment, my mother and my uncle lived in the house together. And on the day I was over there to take her to the doctor, something crossed her mind, and she asked my uncle, she says, what's a neurologist or something? And My uncle says, that's somebody who deals with your brain. And she said, well, there's nothing wrong with my brain. You know, and we didn't get to the doctor that day because she refused to go. So I had to kind of trick her into going to the doctor. I told her we were going to her primary doctor, when in fact we were going to the neurologist. And when she got there, it was too late for her to post.
So I don't want to dwell much into the private life, but I'm curious. This had nothing to do with medical insurance or payments.
No.
This was really just about, I don't want that label.
Right. Well, it's a vanity thing. I mean, you know, no one wants to, you know, be labeled as not being all here. And my mother wanted to be able to still have the freedom of conducting her own life. And she knew that once she resigned herself to the fact she had dementia, that meant that suddenly she would need all kinds of support and people would take over her life. And mainly me, she was concerned about, you know, basically she would become, I would go from being her child to she would become my child in a sense. And she didn't want that to happen.
Lonnie, let me bring you in. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well.
So tell me a little bit about your background and sort of a little where you are now.
I, by education, am a nurse and I have a doctorate in education. And I think
RN,
that's
LPN?
RN.
Okay.
And I was teaching full-time up in North Dakota in Fargo, and people actually live in Fargo.
Great movie.
Yeah, no, it's a great movie. It's a great place. My favorite place I ever lived. And actually, my students started noticing some changes. I was missing classes, wasn't returning assignments, and those kinds of things. I kind of suspected that there was something going on just because I never used to ever write appointments down. And I noticed I was missing appointments and not even remembering that I even scheduled them. So I was worried that maybe I was just overtaxed. You know, I was doing too much. And so that was kind of the first indicator.
And as a registered nurse, you had some previous information, I would assume, regarding Alzheimer's and dementia, et cetera. And so as you traveled down that road, at what point did that box get checked?
Well, I'll tell you, I think because I am a nurse, I recognized that I needed to follow up. So I did it right away. I went to my primary physician and told her that my students had approached me. She sent me immediately for some neuropsych testing and a CT scan, and then I went to a neurophysiologist after those test results came in. So I did follow up right away. I think always through this process that I understand that there's a problem. I know that my son gets tired of me saying, maybe I can relearn how to do that. And it's been impossible. I've tried. I can't read anymore. Numbers sometimes look like letters, and letters sometimes look like numbers. So I listen to like books on tape and listen to the news. But I'll say to my son, maybe if I took a class, I could relearn how to read. And then I know that logically, and I've spoken to physicians about it, that's not going to happen. I want it to happen. But I think that's been the hardest thing for me, is letting go of the things that I was able to do. And I say, I'll say to my son, I think I used to be really smart. And he'll say, you still are smart, it's just different. It's different for you now.
I have to figure out how to phrase it. So you noticed there were changes happening, and you went to the proper physicians, etc. Did they give you medication, or did they just say, this is what's... And how do you know what's next? I guess would be the other question for right now. How do you know... And so this will be a general question for you, but I want her to answer first. Is how do you know what's coming up next?
I think because I'm in the medical field, I have kind of a feel for what might be coming next, but I've been tricked a lot. This is a tricky disease, and I've been fooled a lot. I've had long patches where things have stayed relatively the same, and I've had very short patches where something changed almost immediately. So now I've gotten to the point where I don't try to predict. I used to always think, well, at this point I'll have to quit driving. At this point I'll have to quit teaching. At this point I'll have to quit. And so but actually I ended up almost immediately having to quit teaching, much sooner than I wanted to because of hallucinations. I had to quit driving. And so now I'm starting to have some visual spatial issues. So where my eyes are kind of tricking me, and I think I see things. So it's kind of beyond hallucinations. I have had those almost from the beginning, but I'm having these other things like seeing double and things that that I would have never predicted would happen, and also some social issues that I never thought would happen, anxiety and not being able to be in crowds and big crowds. So I've stopped finally, much to my son's excitement because he gets so overwhelmed. I've stopped trying to predict what's going to happen next. It's so unpredictable.
Was that the nurse in you trying to?
Yes,
Okay.
100%.
Dr. Ansis, everybody's different.
Yeah, so I say this line, and a lot of my lab and my team members all think it's a little hokey, but it's true. No two snowflakes are the same, no two people are the same, and how they progress with the disease can be very different. And what signs and symptoms that they develop, we can't predict always. We kind of have some ideas of that some things may be affected, but we really don't know. It's a lot of following that individual repeatedly over time and then trying to say, oh, okay, this is what's now developing here, what we can do here, some alternatives or ways to try to cope with that. I did mention before, because you asked about the medications, I talked to you about two things that are the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, something called amyloid and something called tau. So there is amyloid that is naturally being produced by everybody here as we're talking right now. Typically, though, we clear that amyloid. In individuals who develop Alzheimer's disease, that amyloid deposits in the brain. That affects those brain cells. Those brain cells start to shrink or die off, and they release this something called tau, this other protein. The combination of amyloid and tau allows us to make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. What I'm telling you now, though, is what's very interesting is that the medications that we have, the last medication for Alzheimer's disease was approved 15 years ago, more than 15 years ago. They don't affect those two hallmarks, that amyloid or tau. So now we are trying to do studies that are looking at these particular hallmarks of the disease to try to treat it and actually treat it earlier on in the disease so that individuals can have, if they do develop the disorder, a very slow and progressive changes. But the answer is we don't know how people are going to progress with the disorder.
Which is, I would argue, part of the fear, is that people don't have any idea what to expect. And all the literature that I read did not give me cause for comfort around not only what I should expect as me, but what my family and friends should expect, which is also part of the issue is everybody walks that day differently, both individually and collectively, because I can wake up, if I'm Lonnie, I wake up tomorrow, I have no idea what tomorrow brings. So I don't know what to tell myself, and I don't know what to tell my family. Would that be fair?
It's very difficult. I mean, you've heard two fantastic, really, first of all, Lonnie is an amazing champion and has been it's amazing what she's been able to do and able to communicate and talk about this and you've also heard Ray talk about this, a lot of people don't want to admit this. They don't want to talk about this. And it's that big elephant in the room that we still are facing. And so, yes, it is a difficult conversation. When you said this bluntness, it is walking on a very difficult situation. But if you bring the individuals together, you bring other people who know that, you can try to calm down that fear. And what you've heard from both what Ray and what Lonnie, two different aspects, that people marshaled those resources, and we have the Alzheimer's Association to marshal those resources so that some of that fear can be abated. I'm not seeing that individual every day. I have to hear the stories. I have to see people like Lonnie. I have to see Ray and his mom bringing the person in. And it's not just Lonnie. I need to hear from those other caregivers to kind of try to help allay some of those concerns. It is a big elephant in the room.
But first of all, tell the truth, which if I think I have Alzheimer's, I may not be willing to do. But so I'm only going to give you my version of the truth, but I need Ray to say, no, that's really not
that's right. You need that collateral source. So that collateral source, he or she who knows that individual very well, can also say, hey, Mom, remember that instance when you drove around and couldn't get around and why you called me about getting lost? Hey, do you remember that episode where Mom left the pot on the stove and it was cooking, almost started a house fire? Hey, do you remember those kinds of episodes? Because a lot of times people don't want to be forthright. And that's why when I have an individual come into my clinic, I ask them to bring that collateral source, bring somebody who else knows them, because it's just as important to hear from not only that individual, but the individual who's in front of me. And I'm asking them questions. So when I see them in the clinic, I'll ask them what happened something a month ago, what happened 3 months ago. So I try to make it personalized and then try to get how they're doing. Oh, you went to a birthday party. Whose birthday party? Because that collateral source is going to be able to tell me that kind of information. And by doing those tests, and I'm telling you right now, it's exciting time. I know this is very scary for Lonnie. I know this is very difficult for Ray. And I know it's very heady times and very scary times as well for the Alzheimer's Association. But we're going to have an ability, and I can tell you in the near future, we have that ability by doing some simple tests, something called a lumbar puncture or spinal tap, to be very reliable in making a diagnosis. And in the years to come, work that's being actually done in St. Louis, we're going to have a blood test. And so that's going to be a system where it's going to make things a lot easier to make that potential diagnosis. Just like you're having a screening test for your prostate, or if you're a PSA, we will have those kinds of abilities to do that. And we now already have imaging markers to look at the brain. So we can now look and diagnose an individual in vivo, meaning alive, 15 to 20 years before they're actually going to be developing the symptoms of the disease. It's a really different field than when I came and went through medical school. The books are being rewritten right now because of work that's being done by the Alzheimer's Association, work that's being done through NIH grants and through other kinds of organizations and through philanthropy of people kind of coming in and starting to talk about this.
I do believe that was on National Public Radio either yesterday or maybe even Sunday about the work that was being done by WashU related to Alzheimer's. So it was a good plug. Adrian, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I am good. So, first of all, tell me what the Alzheimer's Association is, and then I'll ask you a couple other questions about specific situations.
Well, the Alzheimer's is
A little closer for me.
the Alzheimer's Association is a nonprofit organization that really specializes in trying to enhance care and support for families. We also make sure that we are true advocates in the realm of policy in regards to research and investing in research. And we also support not only those who are diagnosed with dementias or Alzheimer's disease, but we support families as well to actually help them navigate through the disease process.
And what kind of supports do you provide to families?
Well, first of all, we have a 24-hour hotline, 7 days a week, that anyone is able to call. In that process, we have helpline specialists that help patients or families that are calling in for assistance. I would say the 3-tier to that is that after that call has been taken, we do a brief assessment from a helpline specialist, which is a master level social worker, that then really interprets what the actual need is. And most often than not, it shifts into a care consultation, and where that social worker spends time with that individual, either with the disease or the family that are there to advocate for that family member.
Do most of the so I'll be right back.
Okay.
One of the things we didn't talk about is age. Where are we at age-wise with Alzheimer's? My understanding is there's both a youth, teenage, something, young person Alzheimer's, and then 65 and older.
There's many different ages for Alzheimer's disease. So typically when we look at individuals who develop Alzheimer's disease, they're older. So what we usually see is that at age 60, there's a small percentage of individuals who have the preclinical, meaning these early changes or early signs. By age 70, about 30% already have some of these changes. By the age of 80, it's about 40-some%. Age 90, more than 50% of all individuals will already have those hallmark changes within the brain. Our brain was just not meant to live that long, and if with a longer and older age, the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is increased. So aging
That's interesting. So as our bodies are, and we always talk about exercise and all those other
Sure.
things. So as our physical body is, and we're pushing the age, I guess we're pushing that barrier of physically being older, living healthier to our 80s and 90s, whatever. What you're saying is the brain may not be in that same category as your body, so you're able to work out. You just may not remember it.
Right. So it's a little more complicated, but you're absolutely right. So there's a brain age, and then there's a body age. So there's a chronological age of the individual, and then there's a brain age of the individual. So they may be very well, but they've had multiple strokes, so their brain actually looks, even though they're 50, their brain may look like a 70 or 80-year-old. Or they may already have some of these changes that are occurring with their brain, such that their brain is a little bit older than their actual stated age. So you did bring 2 points, and I want to get back to two things. So one, you talked about of exercise and other factors. Are there ways that we can kind of modify these kinds of changes? One of the things that we're noticing, both in research that's done here, I'm not trying to plug WashU, but it is done at WashU, but other places as well, is the role of sleep. And actually, Lonnie and I were actually talking about that. So we do think, and I will tell you and I will admit to you, so as being a physician, you are always told you don't need to sleep a lot. You can do all those hours. You can do all that. It's probably bad for your brain. We think that sleep is kind of where you're flushing away all those things that are developing. So it's kind of like this clearage of all those bad amyloid or tau, those evil humors that are occurring. So if not enough sleep, this amyloid or other kinds of changes can develop in the brain. We also think that exercise is probably very good for you, within moderation, of course, because it increases the blood flow to those areas, and that blood flow can provide more nutrients as well as get rid of those bad wastes that are also developing in individuals. We also think that there's some protective factors, so education, engaged in social activities, what we're doing right now, a good way to stimulate the brain and actually protect the brain from some of this onslaught that's occurring as we're getting older, as individuals are getting older. So those are some of those techniques.
So, Lonnie, you talked about your son, I think. Do you feel? But you also talked about the anxiety of going out. How does that? Do you feel like I don't want to go out, but I need to go out just to have that environment or be involved in that environment?
Yes. Yes to both. I don't want to go, usually. And I'll usually start trying to think of reasons not to go about 24 hours before it's time. But my son is generally adamant that I at least try it. So he'll say to me, go do it, and if you need to go home, I will get you back home. But let's see what happens. And so I would say, from my standpoint, that several things have made a huge difference for me. The first thing is staying active. socially. There are things I certainly can't do. I can't teach anymore, but I do volunteer work at the Alzheimer's Association. I go out and speak publicly. I'm on a committee with the NIH. I try to stay as active and busy and try to be a good advocate for Alzheimer's disease. I don't know if we'll see an end to it in my lifetime, but I'm certainly hoping. I would say the second thing is what Adrian talked about, is having a care consultation. I think was the single most important and most effective thing that we did. When even before I had any firm diagnosis, was to have somebody who could kind of guide us and let us know where we could find resources, what the research was saying. So we got a much better overview of kind of where we were, where we might be going, and where we can find the resources we need as things progress.
And you all did that together?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
I'm back, Adrian.
Okay.
So, talk a little bit about the care counseling and what that involves.
Okay, so the care consultation really, like I said before, it's a master level social worker that is actually taking time to sit down with the family, and more often than not, it's sometimes just the family if they cannot get the person who has the diagnosis in. In that care consultation, we talk about a number of things. We talk about, one, the diagnosis itself, what behaviors may come with that diagnosis and how to interact upon those behaviors. We talk about trying to navigate the families through the possibility of any financial discord, meaning that we may talk about some of the legal issues as far as durable power of attorneys for health care, durable power of attorneys for finances, and different things like that. We'll also even go to the realm of talking about, the possibility of a rehab or a long-term care facility if that is needed or warranted by the family. So it could be a myriad of things that we talk about, and it's really going to be based upon what that family is needing for that person or that loved one that has dementia.
If you were looking at all the folks the Alzheimer's Association of St. Louis has worked with, what percentage, what are some of the percentages of people who were able to take that information in, or was it you get further along in the conversation and all of a sudden there's a shutdown because they realize what this means? I'll use the term long term, or are people hungry now for information because they see that the change not only will affect the individual, but it'll affect the family?
I think I would say maybe 50-50. And I think the 50-50 is before they get in the door or before they've actually called our organization. After they have inquired a little bit or either in a care consultation itself, I think, to use your word, yes, they get hungry. I would say most families are wanting to know more because they're in fear of what could happen, or really a lot of the families are not coming at the early stage of diagnosis. We're really finding that most people are coming in at the upset of the mid stage of dementia, but a vast majority are coming at the end stage where there's a crisis. So at that point, yes, families are wanting help. And by the time they get the information they need and they're leaving the office, I think a lot of our families are very thankful. We stay in contact with those families to give a continuation of care to them, even after someone maybe has been placed in a long-term care facility or after a passing. We still try to keep in contact with those families.
Is there a cost for that service?
That cost is zero.
That cost is zero. So there's no reason why folks shouldn't be coming through the door at the very beginning of the process.
Absolutely.
Again, is it no one wants to know? People suspect, but are unsure and are just kind of waiting to see if it gets to the midpoint, if it gets to whatever point, okay, I think something's going on. I now need to check.
I think it's a little bit of all of what you said, but most importantly, I think it's one of fear of actually owning what is going on. And then I also think it's just a thing of, I think it's a culture thing too. It comes with a stigma. No one wants to actually talk about disease, period, let alone Alzheimer's disease. And I think that most families feel like they can handle it to some point, and that point is until it's a crisis. We find that a lot of families, if they're a family of one, like we spoke of today, that family of one is more than likely going to come in and initiate contact for assistance. But we often find that if there's a family of 5 siblings trying to juggle mom or dad who has a diagnosis.
Or mom and dad.
Mom, yes. It could be a little bit daunting to actually hear all of the different behaviors. You have some that are very sweetly demented. And then you have some that have some extreme behaviors with it, where it comes with agitation and aggravation, and we talk about sleep disturbance and different things like that, that causes family a lot of angst.
Ray, how did you cope personally? And feel free not to share whatever you don't want to share. But because you're a family of one,
Yes.
and so you ended up being, I would assume, your mom's caregiver, by and large.
Yes, or facilitating or getting care, yes.
Walk me through that a little bit.
Well, I retired in 2001, and I had been commuting between St. Louis and Alabama to work. And in the 6 months after I retired, I was then commuting between St. Louis and Columbus, because that's where my mother was, and her situation was deteriorating, and it was very difficult because I had 2 children. With my daughter was just entering high school, my son was in his senior year, so I was dealing with normal family stuff, and then all of a sudden now I'm dealing with my mother's rapid deterioration, and on top of that, because my mother and uncle lived together, they both started to sink into dementia, and my uncle's was a much shorter period. From basically his onset to his death was only about 5 years. But my mother's it was so incremental. It just drug on, just little things, and then it kept getting bigger and bigger. And I found the Alzheimer's Association because I had to go someplace and talk to someone who had experience, or other people like myself had experience. And so I found the organization, and I started going to support group meetings. And I was able to then express what I was going through and not have to keep explaining it over and over again to people who don't really understand or not going through it, because a lot of times people who have no experience with Alzheimer's, they want to give you advice, but it's generally not the advice you need. And so by dealing with people or being in the company of people who have had to go through this, they give you more beneficial advice that I could apply to my situation, and it was a slog. It's 20 years of dealing with dementia, and the last 4 years of my mother's life, the person I knew was long gone. She was just here, and so it was just a case of waiting it out and waiting for the end to come. But in those earlier years, my mother resisted it all the way because she did not want to give up her life. She didn't want to give up driving. She wanted to be able to do the things that she wanted to do, and that's why she masked in the early days as long as she could. And she did give me along the way. She would give me little bits to work with. When she realized she absolutely couldn't deal with her situation, then she turned over somewhat to me. But it was slow, and I had to pace myself basically, because I would not have survived the 20 years. One of the big problems, they say, is that caregivers often go before the person they're caring for because of the stress. I think the person with the dementia probably doesn't feel nearly the stress that the person that's caring for them feels.
Adrian, what kind of services does the Alzheimer's Association provide or ways for caregivers to get a break?
Well, we have a multiplicity of programs. So we talked about the care consultations, but we, as Mr. Long discussed, we do have support groups, and we have support groups that are just for adult children caring for loved ones. We have the male support group.
Are those? You said something that triggered a question. Are those numbers growing as people live longer in the city and the region? I know that St. Louis is getting older as a city in terms of the population. Are you seeing some incremental growth in your programs because of that?
Absolutely. So just to kind of give you just a little bit more background of the Alzheimer's Association as far as Greater Missouri, we do see incremental, I can't even say the word.
Incremental.
Thank you. Amount. Because our Greater Missouri chapter isn't just local within the St. Louis metropolitan area. We also cover Columbia and Springfield as far as Joplin. So at least 86 counties for the state of Missouri and 10 for the Illinois area. In those programs, we see, in addition, because we see we're working with healthcare systems, we're working within faith outreach, where we're dealing with churches. And so as we expand our territory, even within us adding diversity and inclusion, we're expanding all of our programs and services and efforts. And with that, we're seeing more people coming to the association for services and programs.
Is it, so I'm asking this question of both of you a little differently. Are you seeing, the last couple studies I read really show there were more African Americans that were trying to care for loved ones, general term, at home. So I would almost expect or assume that more African Americans are coming to your door. Hold that. And and then the research part, we just lost a huge champion for Alzheimer's Association and Alzheimer's, and Mr. Norman Say always told people later in life that he was part of studies done. Are we seeing enough African Americans in that process to help with the research? So, Adrian, you want to go first, and then Dr. Bell.
So yes, Dr. I was going to call him Dr. Say.
If he called that would be an honor. That would be an honor.
But Norman Say, yes, a big advocate for research within the African American community. He and I are served on the African American Advisory Board for WashU, and I guess another plug for WashU under Dr. Morris. If I'm quoting correctly, I think on the average is only about 19% of African Americans in the area are involved in research. So that being said, there's a strong drive not only with WashU but through the Alzheimer's Association. Right now, the Alzheimer's Association, I do want to put a plug in that although we are talking about locally, the Alzheimer's Association initiates research globally. So right now, our association really is impactful when investing at least $167 million with researchers around the globe, with about 500 researchers within 27 countries. And so with that, diversity and inclusion of African Americans and I'll say all brown races are being included in that research. And so I think that's paramount right now.
So there's a big need. We are woefully, if you look at the studies that are being done right now, the number of African Americans or other minorities that are being included in studies is not enough. We need to get more involvement. And quoting a work that's actually, again, sorry, WashU, by Dr. Morris, we've already seen that there are differences potentially between what happens in African Americans versus what happens in Caucasians. So one of those tests that I talked to you about was the spinal fluid, and we're seeing differences in African Americans versus Caucasians in a recent report that came out of WashU. We're also looking, and there's probably differences in cardiovascular disease that are present in African Americans versus Caucasians, and that may lead to changes and differences of expression of how individuals present with cognitive difficulties in African Americans versus Caucasians. We don't have enough of that information. We desperately need more individuals to come in and say, yes, I want to participate in these studies. I want to have pen and paper tests. I want to do potentially these spinal taps, as well as I want to do some of these imaging tests. Now, there are difficulties in doing that. We need to get more into the community. We need your help. We need other people to help us get into the community. I've gone to a number of churches. We need to have other ways to get into the community. We have great advocates, as you're seeing right here, who need to be those champions. And like Norman say, who say, I did this, I did that lumbar puncture. Because as you may remember, a lot of people are very scared of that. And sometimes people feel that they're, quote, almost a guinea pig. And the answer is they're not, because we're actually learning a large amount and we're providing those results back now to those individuals. So the point is that this is a great opportunity to take advantage of, but we really need that partnering and that kind of ways to really open up so that we are really serving communities that are not being met right now.
Is there an age range that you'd like to start at? Is there open to all?
So the age range that we typically look at, so as you were hearing a little bit about, is this adult children study. So we look at individuals anywhere from the ages of 45 on up. So if they have a parent who had Alzheimer's disease, then we are following those individuals. You did mention age for 1 second. I want to take a step back onto that. There are, and you can blame your parents for some things. So is a gene that if you have this copy of this something called apolipoprotein E or ApoE, it increases your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. That doesn't mean you'll develop it, but it just increases your risk. So one of those is genetics. And then there are other individuals who develop it at a much younger age. So they may have a mutation. And so I actually follow those and was in a PBS special about this. And while she was leading that charge of this is something called DIAN, the Dominantly Inherited Alzheimer's Network. And those are people, it's less than 1% of all of Alzheimer's disease, but they have a genetic mutation. And those individuals develop the disease at age 40. Age 50 years of age, so very early age, and it's because mom had it, grandma had it, and now the individual has it. And those people are extremely important because we know they're going to develop the disease, because if you get that gene and that mutation, you will develop the disease. And what they're doing is they're seeing what's going to happen to them. So if mom has it and developed the symptoms at age 50, and now they're age 30, and they have that mutation, we know in 20 years they're going to look just like mom. And so those individuals have been extremely important for us in understanding the disease as well as therapies. And what I can tell you now is in the next year, we're going to start to have a readout from these studies. And if it works for these individuals, we're going to translate that to late onset Alzheimer's disease. And it may be very important because there may be different drugs for different individuals. So for African Americans, just like we have for blood pressure, there are certain drugs that are more beneficial for African Americans than Caucasians. The same thing may be existing for our medications. Right now, it's one size fits all for everybody, but I can tell you in the future, it's probably going to be just like how we do with cancer or other kinds of treatment, where we're going to give you personalized medicine. Here's this medication for you because this we know works in this individual at this age, at this stage of the disease. That's our hope. And the dream would be, even if we don't get that cure, if we can prevent and stave off by 10 years so that individuals have that ability to work and be functional and do those kinds of things with their loved ones, that benefit will be huge to society. And if not, we're going to be bankrupt from this disease alone.
We've only got a few minutes left, and I want to leave a little bit of time for a commercial. Ray, how are you?
I'm pretty good. My family is my mother's youngest brother just died this August. She died last August, and a lot of family members have been dropping, so it creates a level of stress.
Do you feel? I shouldn't make a statement and ask any question, but I'm going to do it anyway. Do you feel like if I could have just done this, or if I just could have done that, maybe we would have delayed the process for a while?
You can't delay the process. You can only pace yourself and ride with it, because you're not going to be able to control it. That was my initial thought when I first entered the situation with my mother.
So I guess backwards way of asking, guilt.
No, I don't have any guilt, because initially I thought I could solve the problem, because I was pretty naive about the condition. But as I got into it, I saw that the only thing I could do is, wherever an opportunity arose, is take advantage of it. But I wasn't going to make things go where I wanted them to go. I had to go with the flow. And that's the best way to ride it out, because you'll stress yourself out if you don't.
Are you still, or I know this was a number of years ago, but are you still seeking counseling or support, or have you moved past that stage now?
And I still attend support group meetings, and I started back in 2001, but now I go mainly to give back from what I learned over my 20 years. And my coping skills that I learned dealing with my mother, I pass on to others, figuring that, I appreciate what I got early on. So, and it also helps me, because I go to meetings. I still learn something, even at this point. I still learn things about the disease. And no two people are the same, and their situation is not identical. But if you have a group together, you'll find that between all the people there, you'll pretty much see what you've gone through. And so I'm still getting things out of it. But I told my son and daughter, pay attention. You saw what I went through with your grandmother. You may go through the same thing with me, or your mother.
Thank you for that. Lonnie, how are you?
I think I'm good. I'm terrified most days because I don't know what's coming next, but I'm extremely optimistic and hopeful. I think that the work that researchers are doing is phenomenal, and I think we get closer and closer to at least some answers. There might not be a cure anytime soon, but at least understanding the disease, I think, makes a huge difference. So I'm very optimistic.
How often do you go to the doctor regarding your Alzheimer's?
I see him. I am on a regular schedule of twice a year, but then I see him intermittently if other things occur along the way.
And so for you, it is just a day-to-day challenge.
It is. It is. It's an everyday challenge. I fortunately have a physician who I also can email, and he emails me back with answers whether I need to change something with medications or I need to go see a different physician. He might say you need to see your primary about that, or he might just give me support. And sometimes he just says, it's part of the process. I understand. If there's anything that you need from me, let me know. But at least I'm able to communicate with him on a regular basis.
Just briefly, what are the conversations like a little bit with you and your son over what you should be doing versus what may or may not be happening?
My son, I will say, first of all, that I have the most remarkable son on the face of the earth. I don't know how I got him. I can't attest to the fact that it's good parenting. In fact, I think it's just the luck of the draw. But he is so supportive. But we have definitely had a role reversal, and my son is definitely more of a parent to me, and I am definitely more of a child to him than ever, and that increases gradually as time goes by. He's very cognizant of how I was and how I really wanted to be at this stage of my life. I never planned to retire. I never planned to be not working. I thought I would die at my desk at 90. I just, always kind of had that vision. And so...
A lot of us have that same vision.
He's very cognizant of that, so he ensures that I stay busy. Even if I want to just stay on the sofa all day and watch TV, he'll say, no, you need to do things. They need help at Alzheimer's. He'll even call people and say, what can she do to help with this? And then take me. And then when I get there, I'm all ready to do it. But I kind of go kicking and screaming sometimes.
Adrienne,
Yes.
November is National Alzheimer's Awareness Month, but I hear there's a event coming up this weekend around Alzheimer's Association.
Yes, we have our St. Louis Walk this weekend on Sunday. Registration begins at 9 a.m. and the ceremony and the walk begin at 1 at the Enterprise Center downtown.
And the walk is 5K, 1K, just walk.
I think it's all of those.
Just walk. Let's give the information out about the Alzheimer's Association. Contact information should people want to know. And I will put that on my website when I get to the
Okay. Well, the contact phone number is 800-272-3900. And if you want to go to our website, you can go to alz.org, or if you want to go directly to the Greater Missouri website, alz.org. alzgreatermissouri.org.
Peggy's back there going, why didn't you know that? But that's okay. Ray Long, Dr. Bo Ansis, Adrian Holden, and Lonnie Schicker, thank you all for being here today. I greatly appreciate it, and we will boost this when I get back to the office. More people need to both take advantage of the Alzheimer's Association as well as be part of studies. Without that, we don't find cures. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you.